Every surgery performed today. Every premature baby in a neonatal unit. Every cancer patient receiving chemotherapy. Every scraped knee that heals without worry. All of them depend on one discovery that most people take completely for granted. And the story of how we found it is one of the most unlikely in human history. A discovery made by accident, in a messy laboratory, by a scientist who almost threw it away. This is the story of penicillin, the mold that saved the world. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe and join me every week as we uncover more of the stories behind the headlines. To understand what penicillin changed, you have to imagine a world where a simple scratch could kill you, where 1 in 9 people who developed skin infections died from them, where pneumonia killed 30% of those who caught it. This was the reality for all of human history until 1945. Hospitals were not places of healing. They were often places where people went to die. Surgery was a desperate last resort because doctors knew that even if the operation succeeded, infection would probably finish what the disease started. Parents lived in constant terror that their children would not survive common illnesses. Scarlet fever, pneumonia, blood poisoning from a cut finger. These were not rare tragedies. They were routine facts of life. Doctors had tried everything. Mercury compounds that poisoned patients as often as they helped. Arsenic treatments that were barely less deadly than the diseases they fought. In 1909, Paul Ehrlich developed Salvarsan, the first targeted antimicrobial drug. He called it a magic bullet because it could kill syphilis bacteria without killing the patient. But it only worked on one disease, and it was still dangerous to use. What medicine needed was something that could kill bacteria without harming people. Something safe enough to give to children, powerful enough to stop infections before they spread. What nobody knew was that nature had already invented exactly what they needed. It was growing on bread, on fruit, in soil, everywhere around them. They just had to notice it. Alexander Fleming was not your typical scientist. His colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital in London called his laboratory the germ pit. Culture dishes stacked everywhere. Experiments left running for weeks past their planned end dates. Most scientists saw this as sloppy technique. Fleming saw it as letting nature surprise him. On September 28, 1928, Fleming returned from a 2-week vacation in Scotland. He had left several bacterial culture plates on his laboratory bench before leaving. Standard practice would have been to clean them up immediately. But Fleming was curious about what might have grown in his absence. As he sorted through the plates, one caught his attention. The Staphylococcus bacteria he had been growing was still there. But in one corner of the dish, a patch of mold had taken root. And around that mold, something extraordinary had happened. The bacteria were gone, not just dead, completely dissolved. Fleming's first reaction was irritation, another ruined experiment. But then his scientific curiosity kicked in. He looked closer. The clear zone around the mold was perfectly defined. Whatever this mold was producing, it was killing bacteria with surgical precision. "That is funny," he said to his assistant. And with those 2 words, the antibiotic age began. Fleming identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium. He started calling the mysterious substance it produced penicillin. But here is where the story almost ended before it began. Fleming could only produce tiny amounts of penicillin, not enough to treat even a single patient. He published his findings in 1929, but the medical community showed little interest. Fleming himself lost enthusiasm and moved on to other research. He started referring to his discovery dismissively as Fleming's mold juice. For 11 years, the most important medical discovery in human history sat forgotten in a scientific journal. In 1940, as German bombs fell on London, 2 scientists at Oxford University were about to change the world. Howard Florey was an Australian pathologist with a gift for organizing research teams. Ernst Boris was a Jewish biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany just years before. Chain brought exactly what Fleming had lacked: the chemical expertise to purify and concentrate penicillin. What nobody knew at the time was that Chane's background as a refugee would drive him to work with desperate urgency. Together, Florey and Chane approached penicillin not as a curiosity, but as a systematic research project. By May of 1940, they had produced enough purified penicillin for a crucial test. On May 25th, they infected 8 laboratory mice with lethal doses of Streptococcus bacteria. 4 mice received injections of penicillin. 4 received nothing. By the next morning, the results were undeniable. All 4 untreated mice were dead. All 4 treated mice were alive and healthy. 100% death versus 100% survival. Think about that for a second. The Oxford team knew they had something revolutionary, but they faced a massive problem. They could only produce penicillin in laboratory quantities. To save human lives, they needed industrial production. And Britain, in the middle of the Blitz, did not have the resources to build penicillin factories. So Florey made a desperate decision. He flew to the United States, carrying a small sample of penicillin mold in his coat pocket. He had no idea that his midnight flight would launch the largest medical manufacturing effort in human history. American pharmaceutical companies saw the potential immediately, but they also saw the challenge. How do you mass-produce something that grows in a petri dish? The answer came from the most unlikely place imaginable: a grocery store in Peoria, Illinois. Mary Hunt worked as a laboratory assistant at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Northern Regional Research Laboratory. Her job was to scour local markets for moldy fruit and vegetables. The search for better penicillin-producing molds had become global, but Hunt was methodical about checking every grocery store in town. In 1943, she found a cantaloupe so covered with mold that most people would have thrown it away immediately. Hunt brought it back to the lab. The mold strain from that single cantaloupe produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original sample. Virtually all penicillin manufactured today descends from Mary Hunt's grocery store find. Now that is a story worth telling. American companies used deep tank fermentation to scale up production. By June 1944, Allied forces had stockpiled enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier expected in the D-Day invasion. American pharmaceutical companies were producing 2.3 million doses per month. Companies like Pfizer, which had been small chemical suppliers, suddenly found themselves at the center of a medical revolution. The war had created urgent demand and unlimited funding for penicillin production. But the real transformation came in March 1945, when penicillin became available to American civilians. Time magazine called it the miracle drug. And the results were immediate and dramatic. Within 2 years, childhood deaths from bacterial infections dropped by 80% in developed countries. For the first time in human history, parents did not have to fear losing their children to common infections. What invention should I cover next? The psychological impact was as revolutionary as the medical one. Parents could finally relax. A scrape on the playground was no longer a potential death sentence. Surgery became routine instead of desperate. Entire medical specialties were born because doctors could finally operate without the constant fear of post-surgical infections. Today, 40% of all medicines prescribed globally contain penicillin or penicillin-derived compounds. Modern medicine would simply collapse without antibiotics. Organ transplants, chemotherapy, premature infant care, routine surgery. All of it depends on our ability to control bacterial infections. But here's the thing about great inventions. They solve one problem and create an entirely new world. And that new world comes with new problems nobody anticipated. By 1947, just 2 years after civilian availability, hospitals were reporting the first penicillin-resistant bacteria. Alexander Fleming himself had warned about this in his 1945 Nobel Prize speech. He said overuse of penicillin would lead to resistant bacteria. He was right, but even Fleming could not have predicted the scale of what was coming. Today, antibiotic-resistant infections kill over 700,000 people annually worldwide. Some bacteria have become resistant to every known antibiotic. we are facing the possibility of returning to a pre-antibiotic world. When you have been around long enough, you start to see how everything connects. The same miracle that saved millions of lives in World War II is now threatened by our own success in using it. Penicillin created the modern pharmaceutical industry. It sparked a golden age of antibiotic discovery between 1945 and 1955, when over 100 new antibiotic compounds were found. It enabled the baby boom by giving parents confidence their children would survive. It made modern surgery possible. It changed the fundamental experience of being human. We went from a species that lived in constant fear of infection to one that barely thinks about bacteria at all. But Fleming, who died in 1955, lived to see the beginning of antibiotic resistance. He still believed antibiotics would remain miracle drugs forever. He had no way of knowing that his warning about overuse would prove so prophetic. The mold that saved the world is still saving lives every day. But the story is far from over. Scientists are racing to find new antibiotics, new ways to fight resistant bacteria, new solutions to the problems that success created. Because that is what humans do. We solve problems, create new problems, and then solve those too. The cycle never ends. And honestly, that gives me hope. Remember, this video is for educational purposes only. Always do your own research. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the invention that changed everything, subscribe for more stories about the innovations that shaped our world. And let me know in the comments what invention you think I should explore next.